Hello, hello. Sam. Hello, hello. Is it on? Green says yes. Hi, everyone. Can you find your seats? Great, thank you. I am Molly Brody, and I'm an Executive Vice President of the Kaiser Family Foundation, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all here at KFF. Our headquarters has been based in San Francisco now for about a year and a half after almost 25 years in the Silicon Valley. We moved to San Francisco for a variety of reasons, but one of the key goals was to be able to hold events exactly like this one. We wanted to be able to convene conversations with experts, with journalists, and with engaged policy people on tough issues facing our country, our state, and certainly our community. So thank you all for coming. I do have one special welcome to share with our very own Diana Chapman-Walsh, who's sitting here in the front row and is with us today. Diana is a former president of Wellesley College, and she is really a beloved emeritus trustee here at KFF. And what I want to say is that it's Diana's own personal commitment to studying and engaging on the issue of climate change, and it compelled her to teach many of us here about the crucial link between climate change and health. It caused all of us to more deeply engage in this topic that we're all going to talk about today. So thank you, Diana, for that. Screwing up Sam's slides. Okay, Sam is going to have to come fix this. I'm also particularly looking forward to this conversation as it illuminates the results of our recent joint survey project with the Washington Post. Now, we began our survey partnership project with the Washington Post back in 1995. Sorry, Sam. Thank you. It was an experiment in combining survey research in an in-depth way with reporting and storytelling to try to better inform the public about important issues facing the nation. The partners jointly pick a topic, we jointly design the questionnaire, and we analyze the results. Suffice to say that this experiment has been highly successful, and the survey results that Liz is going to talk about today come from the 34th survey in that partnership. So once again, thank you for being with us, and I'm going to ask Liz Hamill, our Vice President and Director of Public Opinion and Survey Research, to take it away and share with you the results of our survey. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that great introduction, Molly. And I'm Liz Hamill. Along with Molly, I direct the public opinion and survey research work here at KFF. And I've been working on the KFF Washington Post partnership surveys, not since the beginning, but since 2002, so for a long time. And I'm happy to be here to tell you about our latest survey on climate change. So just a little bit here about how we did the survey. It was online and by phone using the AmeriSpeak panel, which is maintained by NORC at the University of Chicago. We interviewed over 2,000 adults and 600 teens, ages 13 to 17, and we were in the field this summer in July and August. There is a large body of research on the public's views on climate change that goes back to the 1990s, and for this project, we wanted to build on that work, but we also wanted to bring something new to the table. So there are a few things about this project that really make it unique and exciting. First was that we were able to interview teens at a time when a lot of media attention is focused on their climate activism, but there hasn't been a quantitative national study of teens' attitudes on this topic for many years. Second, we designed this sample to be able to look at specific regions of the country that have experienced different types of extreme weather events that might be associated with climate change. So you can see here that we did oversamples in the southwestern states. That includes California, the upper mountain west and Midwest, the southeast and Gulf Coast areas, and then the upper northeast, including New England. And so we're able to break down some of the results about how attitudes differ regionally. And then finally, in this project, we wanted to go beyond measuring people's belief in climate change or their support for policies, but we wanted to probe on some of the trade-offs associated with these policies and people's willingness to make sacrifices to address the issue. And so for this presentation, I'm going to give a brief overview of our findings, and I'll focus on the national results, but I'll break some things out by regions and provide some California-specific results where that's appropriate. So I'm really going to structure this as sort of going through five key themes that came out of the survey. So starting with the first one, we did find an increasing sense of urgency among the public when it comes to climate change, but there are really deep partisan divides in how people think about this issue. So starting with people's sense of urgency, we asked people if they think climate change is best described as a crisis, a major problem but not a crisis, a minor problem, or not a problem. And we were able to compare to a survey that used similar methodology back in 2014 to look at trends over time. So a couple things to notice here. First, a majority since 2014 has either said climate change is a crisis or a major problem, and that has increased over the last 5 years. And we do see an increase over the last 5 years in people seeing climate change as a crisis, but that increase is coming entirely from Democrats and independents. So you can see that the shares of Democrats and independents seeing it as a crisis has increased over time. Among Republicans, 12% said it was a crisis in 2014 and the same share in 2019. There is an increasing concern among Republicans as well, but it's mostly in the share calling climate change a major problem. But by 2019, a slim majority of Republicans, 52%, said it is a crisis or a major problem. Others who've looked at trends over a longer period of time have shown that the partisan gap in climate change attitudes across a variety of measures has actually widened since the late 1990s. So here's just another illustration of the partisan divide, and this is on the question of how urgently the U.S. needs to act to prevent the worst effects of climate change. So overall, almost half of the public thinks that the U.S. needs to drastically reduce fossil fuel use in the next few years. That's the 46%. And about 4 in 10 say that the U.S. just needs to gradually reduce its fossil fuel use over a period of decades. And just a small share says, no, we don't need to reduce fossil fuel use at all to deal with this. But if you look at those partisan splits, it's really a big difference, with 66% of Democrats and just 16% of Republicans. So there's really a big difference in how people think about this issue depending on their partisan lens. Another big takeaway we found is that climate change is not a frequent topic of conversations and knowledge on the issue is mixed. So just kind of starting with the overall issue environment, climate change is not, we asked about 6 different issues. Climate change was not at the top. It ranks behind things like healthcare, the economy, immigration, and gun policy for adults. I'm not showing the data here, but we see partisan divides on this question of how important the issue is to you, with Democrats ranking it second behind healthcare and Republicans ranking it much lower. What may be even more surprising is that even for teens, the share saying climate change is extremely important to them is about the same as the share who say the same thing about issues like healthcare, the economy, and gun policy. So while this is an issue that teens and adults see as important, for teens it's not necessarily the singular defining issue for their generation. When we ask people, how often they discuss the topic of climate change with their friends and family, if you look at the dark blue part of the bars, you see that for both teens and adults, only about 1 in 10 say they often discuss the topic with friends or family members. And even when you add in that next set of occasionally, we don't reach 50% mark for either adults or teens. We also found that this is not necessarily a topic that's being widely discussed in classrooms for teens. So one of the more surprising findings was that the share of teens who say they've learned a lot in school about ways to reduce the effects of climate change actually decreased from 25% in a Yale survey from 2010 to 14% in our survey. So thinking about what teens are learning in school, knowledge on an issue like this is important, especially thinking about how people might translate that knowledge into action in their own lives. And we find mixed knowledge about the major contributors to climate change. So if we start at the top, some of the major contributors are widely recognized: deforestation, driving vehicles, burning fossil fuels. Large shares recognize these as major contributors to climate change. But the public also has some misconceptions about things that are not major contributors. Particularly for teens, 57% think plastic bottles and bags are a major contributor to climate change when they should probably be considered more of a minor contributor. And then some things that are, scientists say clearly are not happening: the sun getting hotter. We see about 4 in 10 adults and teens thinking that this is a major contributor, along with things like volcanic eruptions and overuse of water, about 2 in 10 thinking that these are major contributors to climate change. And then some things that we know are bigger contributors are not as widely recognized. So for adults and teens, only between about 2 and 3 in 10 recognize airplane travel and raising cattle as major contributors to climate change. We also asked people what actions they've taken in their own lives to reduce their carbon footprint. And we do find substantial numbers of people, so about half of adults and 4 in 10 teens say they've taken some type of action to reduce their carbon footprint in the past 2 years. And then when we ask them to say in their own words what actions they've taken, some of the responses are quite general: recycling more, reducing plastic use, conserving water, but others are more directly related to energy consumption, like driving less, using less energy at home, or switching to a more fuel-efficient vehicle. So it's kind of a mixed bag of actions that people report taking. Moving on to our third key takeaway, the public does worry about the effects of climate change, and in particular the health effects, which is something we'll talk about today. But the public is also skeptical of the cost of government intervention. So if we, look at who people think will be most harmed by climate change, the public is worried about various groups, but they mainly see it as a problem that will hurt people other than themselves. So we asked people how much they think various groups will be hurt by climate change in the long term, and here this is the share that say each of these groups will be hurt a great deal. And you can see that the largest shares relate to future generations, people in poorer developing countries, and U.S. residents in coastal areas or lower income communities. About a third of people think people in their own state will experience a great deal of harm, and only about a quarter say the same about themselves personally. This is one where we did find some variations by region on the question of how much people in your own state will be harmed by climate change. And you can see that residents of the Southeast, where they've experienced a lot of hurricanes and flooding, as well as the Southwest here, where we've experienced wildfires and things like that, including California, people are more likely to expect a great deal of harm to people in their own state. We are focused on health today, and indeed we found that 7 in 10 people say they are very or somewhat worried that climate change will harm the health of people in the U.S. But we also asked about how people worry about the effects of government regulation and taxes aimed at addressing climate change, and you can see that large shares are worried about these type of actions either causing financial stress for ordinary Americans or hurting the U.S. economy. When we look at who is most worried about these various things, we do see some partisan differences that you might expect. Democrats are more likely to say they're worried about the health effects of climate change. Republicans are more worried about the potential impacts of government regulation and taxes. But beyond partisanship, we also found that younger adults are more likely to worry about the health effects of climate change. When we look at lower income adults, it's interesting because they are both more likely to worry about the health effects of climate change, but also more likely to worry about those regulations and taxes causing financial stress for ordinary Americans. Moving on to our fourth key takeaway, we find that U.S. adults support various policies to address climate change, but few people are willing to make personal sacrifices in the form of higher gas and electricity taxes. So just starting with who the public thinks ought to be taking more action, there is lots of blame to go around. Not surprisingly, at the top of the list, 76% say the Chinese government should be doing more, but also, large shares say the U.S. government and their own state governments should be doing more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Here again, we can look by region and at California specifically, and Californians are somewhat more forgiving, perhaps related to the fact that the state has been on the forefront of climate change policies, but still half of Californians say the state government is doing too little to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's also an appetite nationwide for state governments to be more ambitious in their climate policies than the federal government. So here we found that 2/3 said that they would support their state government setting stricter fuel efficiency standards for vehicles than the federal government, and 7 in 10 would support their state setting more ambitious targets for renewable energy than the federal government. Here we did not see big regional differences, so Californians were about as likely as people nationally to support more aggressive action in our state. So as I mentioned at the top, besides support for policies, we also wanted to examine some trade-offs and support for different mechanisms to pay for climate change policies. So, it's not surprising we find this when you ask about ways to pay for various things. People are very willing to tax the wealthy in order to pay for climate change policies. And a majority also said they would support raising taxes on companies that burn fossil fuels, even if that might lead to increased energy prices. But when we look at other potential mechanisms, including adding to the national debt, a majority is opposed. And when we asked about various taxes that might hit people in their own pocketbooks, taxes on residential electric bills, or an increase in the federal gasoline tax, we tested different levels of these taxes in terms of dollar amounts, and we found that at least a slim majority, if not a larger majority, was opposed to these various taxes. So it's not something that at this point people are willing to say they're willing to pay more for. And again, we can look at California here, and we see slightly higher support in California compared to other regions for some of these taxes, but it's still a bare majority in California that would support a $2 monthly tax on electric bills, and just a third would support a $10 a month tax. Finally, and this is where we can drill down a little bit more into the different regions and what people have experienced, we find that nationally and across regions, again, partisans have very different views of severe weather events and the role that climate change plays in those. So starting with the general question, this is not about your specific area, but just in general, we ask people if they think extreme weather events are becoming more severe, less severe, or staying about the same. And then for those that said they're becoming more severe, we said, do you think that's caused mostly by climate change, mostly by natural year-to-year variations, or is it a mix of the two? And so if you start by looking at the column of data on the right-hand side, about 2/3 of people, 65%, say that yes, weather events are becoming more extreme, but there's a mix in terms of whether people think that's caused mostly by climate change or more of a mix of climate change and natural year-to-year variations. And again, we see differences between Democrats and Republicans just in the perception of whether weather events are becoming more severe, so 81% of Democrats versus 43% of Republicans. But if you look at the share that think that's mostly caused by climate change, you see an even starker partisan difference with 43% of Democrats and just 9% of Republicans thinking that this is driven mostly by climate change. Here we asked more specifically whether people think that the area where they live has experienced different types of weather events in the past 5 years. And so starting here with the question of droughts and water shortages, here's where we see big variations by region. So you can see that, in the Southwest overall, 73% say that their area has been affected by droughts and water shortages, up to 79% in California. California. And, you know, in California, about half of all residents say that not only has their area experienced this, but they think that climate change is a major factor, and another 22% say climate change is a minor factor. So obviously, you know, other regions that have not experienced this as much, we see very different results. Similarly, when we asked about wildfires, something I'm sure we'll talk about on the panel today, in California, 4 in 10 say that their area has experienced wildfires and climate change is a major factor, and another quarter say it's a minor factor. We also asked about different types of weather events, extreme heat, flooding, severe storms and hurricanes, and I'm not going to show you all the data, but it's not surprising that for things like hurricanes, those living in the southeast and in the northeast are more likely to have experience these and to see climate change as a major contributor. But despite these big differences by region, those partisan differences that I talked about at the beginning are still in effect. And this is true across regions and across weather events. So if you just look at the top line there, when we look at the Southwest region and the share who say that their area has experienced wildfires and that climate change is a major factor, there's a 41 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans. Similar, if you look at other regions, for the Southeast and the upper Northeast for severe storms and hurricanes, and for the Midwest and upper Mountain West, same sort of differences for flooding. So even though where you live affects your experience of weather events, your party identification is still strongly associated with your belief about the role of climate change in those events, and this has implications for how we talk to people living in different areas about potential solutions to climate change. So that is my high-level summary of the survey. There's a lot more in our report online, and I'm happy to share more data with anyone who has questions. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Anna Maria and the panel to lead us on a very interesting discussion.
Great. Hello. Can you hear me?
Great. He's on. You want to switch over to here?
Yeah,
and then
sure.
So we
you
have
kind
a
of see if
third
he will
panelist who is on
He's
his way.
here?
He'll be here in just a moment. But I can get started
got a
with
thumbs
introductions.
up from the back, so I
Yeah.
think he might be here
I
somewhere.
can get started with introductions in the meantime. I think he knows who he is. So thanks so much for joining us. I think this is going to be a really lively and interesting conversation. Let me just start by introducing the panel. So first we have Kate Gordon. Kate is California's Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and also Senior Advisor to Governor Newsom on climate. Kate comes to the Governor's Office as a nationally recognized expert on the intersection of climate change, energy, and economic development. She was a co-author of a chapter in the 4th National Climate Assessment about how to reduce the risks of climate change through adaptation. And prior to joining the administration, she was a senior advisor at the Paulson Institute, and she's worked on a climate policy at a variety of places, including the Climate and Energy at the Center for the Next Generation and the Center for American Progress. Sorry, butchered a couple of those names, but so thanks for being here, Kate.
Thank you.
And then we have Steve Muffson. He's a reporter with the Washington Post, where he currently covers the business of climate change. He's recently written about the places which have already surpassed 2 degrees Celsius temperature change on average, and conflicts between the federal government and the state of California on emissions and climate-related policy, among many other things. Steve has been a reporter with the Post for 30 years, writing about economic policy, China, diplomacy, energy, and the White House during that time. And then our third currently invisible panelist is Kevin Hamilton. He is the CEO of the Central California Asthma Collaborative, which is based in Fresno and has worked on improving health and reducing air pollution in the San Joaquin Valley, which is a place that has really been, unfortunately, at the forefront of thinking about pollution in the nation, but also internationally. Kevin and his colleagues have worked on a variety of studies with researchers from Berkeley and UCLA, among other places and other institutions, looking at the health effects of air pollution and other environmental conditions on health, and implementing interventions at hospitals and in other health settings. He also serves on the California Air Resources Board Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And I'm Anna Berry Jester. I'm a senior correspondent with KHN. We're an editorially independent nonprofit health news service that's published by KFF. Where we are today. So today we're going to be talking about the health impacts of climate change. We get sort of regular updates from commissions at the state, national, international level on projections about the environmental impacts of climate change, what that's meant to look, what that should look like in terms of weather and temperature and what we can expect from there. But we hear less because there's less research on what the very specific public health changes that are expected to be. But according to the experts, those risks are very real and expected to be both deadly and costly. I think, as we saw in those surveys results, a lot of people don't see themselves in those risks right now. It's something like 25% of people understand that these things might impact them in their lifetime. But the interesting thing is that the experts also believe that in addressing those particular risks, we can deal with some of our longstanding issues around pollution and other things that have also been issues in the state of California for a long time. So I asked each of the panelists to sort of answer a question to kind of situate us and get us started on where we are right now. And I was going to have Steve start. And I was looking for him. He's reported internationally and all over the country on this issue. I'm curious if you can get us started on sort of where we are in California in comparison to the rest of the nation and the planet, sort of, in thinking about climate and policy and what the risks are here.
Sure. So at the Post, we we write about California in a couple of different contexts, and California is, of course, a special case in so many ways, and that's good. But one of the ways we write about it is in terms of the state's role in taking the lead in a lot of climate-related things. And so one example of that is the story about the commitment to have a 100% zero carbon electricity grid, and that's something we covered a bit, and because it's not only important here, but because it has a huge impact across the country. And we've seen other states falling into line about that, although it's worth noting that there are special characteristics of California that make it a little bit easier to hit that target. Yeah. One is that the climate's fairly mild, so air conditioning is not a big factor. The amount of electricity, amount of carbon that the state emits from the electricity grid is around 24%. Nationwide, I think that's right, mid to low 20s, and nationwide it's more like 35%, and that's partly thanks to the hydropower here, geothermal power, as well as the climate and the type of industry that's here. So that's one place, one area, California and its leadership role. Another important aspect is California's role in the in regulations and in resisting the Trump administration's efforts to try to roll back these regulations. And the key part of rolling back the regulations is health related. The administration is trying to change the equation and the calculations about health benefits. So whereas the Obama administration implemented rules on clean power, on mercury emissions, those and they calculate benefits in terms of fewer asthma attacks, longer longevity, and by Obama administration calculations, the benefits far outweigh the cost of the regulation. But the Trump administration has come in and said that these calculations aren't right, and then it's much more expensive to make some of these changes. It's a little bit of a weird thing in terms of timing. I'm not sure I fully understand it, because most coal plants have met their mercury standards by 2016, 2017. There aren't that many people left who would benefit. A couple of those people are big contributors to the Trump campaign, and one of them has declared bankruptcy since all this happened. So how that's going to affect their ability to succeed in this area isn't clear, and it's all going to be settled in large part in the courts. And then the last area that we've been covering is really the war between the administration in California and the effort to try to take away California's authority to set tougher standards for tailpipe emissions, which is very much a health as well as a climate-based power. And so this is a little baffling because it seems fairly clearly set out in the Clean Air Act that California has this authority, and the administration is trying to say no, and the car companies, as you know, are split. So, we've been spending a good bit of time writing about that in the context of this struggle over California's special authority in this area.
Kate, you have the privilege of helping the governor think about policy now, but also directing the Office of Research and sort of thinking about what this looks like going forward. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of, given California's unique policy landscape and its unique geographical landscape, what we're talking about when we talk about climate change in California in the future.
Sure, and thanks for having us here. It's a great conversation. So the Office of Planning and Research is an office in the governor's office. It's sort of like, for those who know the federal system, like the Council on Environmental Quality or other offices in the president's office. And we have the statutory responsibility to do long-range planning for the governor and for the cabinet, which means we do think about these issues, particularly where those issues intersect with land use policy, which essentially means we're doing everything that has to do with housing, transportation, conservation, and climate resilience. So it's a lot of things. And I've done a lot of work on, but I also think it's really relevant in this conversation, the physical impacts from climate change. So we talk about climate, there's more than two, but just to divide them into two big areas of discussion. Often there's this sort of, what the financial community calls the physical risk side. So what are the physical risks to your sort of people and places from the impacts of climate change? It's a very local conversation. It's very specific to specific places. And in California, it's very wide-ranging because we have a huge state with a lot of people living in it. And then the other side is what the financial community calls the transition risks. So they say, what are the risks that you're making investments that aren't going to work, that are going to be stranded in the long range because we have all these policies, all these programs that are actually addressing climate change. That's a more of a global conversation because the global climate investment and global climate emissions conversation it's wide-ranging. It's a local in terms of sort of where your solutions are, but it's very wide-ranging. On the physical side, California is just enormous. I knew that, but I think coming to work for the state has really underscored that. I was in, my family was in Banff for the summer, and we drove into Canada, and it was like, population 36 million people, and I was like, that's less than we have in California. It's kind of overwhelming, and because we're so geographically large and diverse, we have every climate impact you could imagine. So we have glacial melt, we have sea level rise, we have extreme heat, we have flooding, we have drought, we have fire. It's sort of everything, right? And all those things are happening at different times of the year in different parts of the state. And so really what I think we see, and we've seen it, our first week in this administration was characterized by the PG&E bankruptcy and then the ratings agencies downgrading all of our utilities. So what we're seeing is this really specific and real intersection of climate impacts, so more frequent and severe events across all the things I just said, and frankly, the state's economy. So it's an interesting dichotomy because we just came out yesterday with our new budget projections, and we have a $7 billion surplus next year, according to the Legislative Analyst's Office, which is amazing. But we also have these massive infusions of money going into disaster preparedness and response, more and more and more as FEMA actually pulls back from that. And that's partially political and partially because FEMA has so many incidents they're dealing with nationwide now that they're pulling back from all of they just don't have as much money to spend on any single event. So we see, I think, looking forward in California, and my job really to a great extent is to think about how we're making investments and decisions today. If you think of California sort of as a big investor and asset owner and just a policymaker, what kinds of decisions are we making today that are really specific place-based decisions that will have these implications going forward? And I think that where the biggest difference is in some ways with the last administration, which was incredibly forward thinking on climate, and Governor Brown is a huge leader on this issue, is in this sort of integration of this thought, this thinking around climate risks and climate impacts into every single part of the government. So we're not just talking, and it's interesting, just looking at your survey results, and I think about this a lot, you know, economy is a climate issue and healthcare is a climate issue. And so I think people separate them out sort of artificially. And in some ways, I think we're overly simplifying by putting climate in some kind of a box, because in fact, what we're seeing in the state, and the governor just did an executive order on this, is every one of our transportation investments, every one of our housing investments, every one of our, you know, Department of General Services sort of investments in all our assets, our prisons, our wastewater treatment plants, whatever, needs to be done with this in mind, both the sort of bringing down emissions, getting to that net zero level, carbon neutrality by 2045, and becoming more resilient. So where are we building roads? And the last thing I'll say is where this really all comes together is on the land use stuff, because the area in which California is actually failing miserably on meeting our climate goals is in transportation. And most of that failure, we're going up by 6% a year in our transportation emissions. Most of that 6% is from people driving to work and services. It's mostly vehicle miles traveled. It's mostly our land use patterns. It's a housing affordability problem. It's a road problem. It's a zoning problem. I mean, it's all these things. So what we're really trying to do is say this is an integrated issue across all of our policy areas. It's a health issue. It's a housing issue. It's a transportation issue, and how do we sort of start taking that kind of holistic approach to it, because it will define not only people's lived experience in the future, but also just looking at it from a state perspective and taxpayer fiduciary perspective, it's going to cost all the money we have if we don't get ahead of it.
Yeah, and we are definitely going to come back to transportation, so I'm glad you brought that up. Kevin, I introduced you in your absence, but I'm so glad you're here. And I wanted you to, you have this very unique perspective of having spent a lot of time with all of the stakeholders in the San Joaquin Valley who think about health and sort of the impacts of pollution, which are, incredibly linked to climate change, but sort of predate some of what we've been thinking of as climate change. So I was hoping you could give us a bit of a sense of what those health impacts are that we're seeing right now, as well as what's expected in the future. But I think that point that some of this is already happening here is, I'd love to hear you address that a little bit as well.
So, Kate, I thought you framed it well when you said risk. So this is really about risk. Climate is, the changes in our climate are exposing weaknesses in our existing systems, economic system, healthcare system, transportation system, all these different systems that have been built in a way that assumed that the climate would continue to move forward in a reasonable fashion, not in this accelerated sort of mankind-driven. You can argue with me about that all you want, but I was a geology major, and I can tell you this happens, but it never happens this quickly. So it's obvious, as my brother used to say, there has to be an impact when 7 billion butts hit the earth. So he's a guy who's a diesel mechanic, so I figured if he could say that, right? So I think you look at it through that lens, and that's how I think about it. When I look at the economy, I see the stress that these climate changes are putting on our economies. The economy of California, the economy of the world, let's face it. It's driving it downward. It's driving it outward in terms of outward migration. The stresses that we're feeling from that are in California are, of course, the immigration into our communities of whole new groups of people who come from places that, quite frankly, are very different from ours and bring with them great things, but also bring with them often health problems that we're not necessarily used to dealing with here. And as the climate shifts and looks more like the places they came from, while those health problems might not have been able to do well here and thrive and grow, we start to see the front edge of it in things like Zika and West Nile. But there's been these random cases of dengue fever. So it's pretty crazy when we talk about developing sort of a sub-Saharan type of environment in some parts of this country, and we think about valley fever in the valley, which is not, by the way, in the valley only, it's in the 7-9 western states. Coccidiomycosis is a really challenging disease. Everybody is worried about it right now, and I get that. However, while the percentages of cases are rising, the numbers are not all that, scary to me. Numbers of children who are now being diagnosed with asthma, that scares me. When I realized that I was looking at data in 1996, seeing a childhood rate of asthma in California of about 6.5%, and the childhood rate now is up around 11, that scares me. When the rate in the valley back in 1996, and I was getting excited because it was at 9%, moved to 16, and now we're hitting 1 in 5, 1 in 4, depending on, according to California Department of Public Health, and that data is 2 years old. That scares me, quite frankly. So now that's a lot of people. Okay? When you're talking about 1% of a population, that's a lot of people. I always say, bring it back to the numbers. It's fine to say a certain percent rise in this or that. Tell me what the actual numbers are. I mean, I'd feel terrible if it's in a certain group or a certain area or whatever it happens to be, if that percentage has got a problem. But I need to know the numbers so I can understand the impact. What kind of assets do I need to bring to bear on the problem to face that rise in whatever that happens to be? With regard to climate in the valley, I mean, I think, and in California, these wildfires are just the leading edge of the whole thing, all right? So this creates black carbon. So black carbon is probably one of the most cancer-causing of all of the climate pollutants. The elemental black carbon, of course, from diesel, much worse. We have a lot more of that. I got to experience quite a bit of it on my drive up here today. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's truck day on the 99, if people don't know it. That's when, everything's moving and moving here. So with transportation, I got to experience the stress that I had yesterday. Is my carbon footprint higher if I fly?
Yes.
Or if I drive?
Fly.
And I elected to drive, yes. I made the decision, I did the calculation, and I thought, this is the world I'm in today, okay? So I sacrificed being here on time in the end because traffic being unpredictable, and I got to experience where somebody who's created a solution who thinks that if I create this solution, it will reduce the amount of pollution. I'm assuming that was in the equation, and whoever decided to design the bridge the way that they did in the entrance to it coming into the city. However, the population overcame that because that wasn't planned for as part of the design. And that's what we're talking about with climate as well. So the valley is looking at an in-migration, and is the Inland Empire in Southern California. And I believe we'll probably see it up north as well, though I know the folks up there don't believe it, but I'm afraid it's coming, of folks fleeing this area. It's already happening because of the economics. But as we start losing actual coastline, and that also changes the local environment, by the way, makes it not quite as hospitable, we're going to see those same people showing up. Now, will they be the people here who make $1 million, $1 billion a year? No. There'll be people who are moderate to low income. And so the valley is already experiencing roughly a little less than half of its population living at 150% or less than the federal poverty line. I come from Appalachia, okay? I come from outside of Youngstown, Ohio. Everybody I grew up with or went to school with, my first job, in fact, coming out of the Navy, was in the steel mill, either in the mine or the mill, okay? That's the way it was. So the way that people think back there is very different than here, and I think people in California, we also have to kind of get over that and stop expecting them to somehow understand everything that's going on, because they were raised in a different place, in a different way, and we have to help them through that. But here in California, that experience is very different, but the valley is not. The valley is very much like where I grew up, farming. We had farms everywhere. Half my family was in farming. But farming is threatened by climate. Why? Because drought. Because it's going to get really hot. The glacial ice is melting off the Sierra Nevada, which is core water for the valley. and for part of California. It's not being recharged at the rates we need it to be. And so eventually, yet the population is also growing. How are we going to feed them? How are we going to keep providing water for them to drink? When do we get to the point, again, of other countries where fresh water is a precious commodity? We're already there in the valley. 300 communities in the valley are unable to drink water that comes out of their tap. The majority of them are paying between $80 and $100 a month for that water. I think that's the other part of the story that's not often told. That water's not free. They still have to pay for it, and they use it to flush their toilet. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, there's a lot there. We'll try and break that down a little bit in conversation. Let's start with transportation, though, because it really is just such a giant problem. And as you said, Kate, sort of intertwined with absolutely all of the other states' really big challenges, right? The economic inequality, housing, jobs, certainly. For starters, can the state achieve its goals both in terms of emissions and health outcomes if we don't improve our public transportation?
I mean,
can we do this on electric vehicles?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. And it's the California Air Resources Board actually came out with a report at the end of last year that was an analysis. Legislature called for them to analyze how our big sort of land use piece of the cap and trade program and the scoping plan is working. And they did a big analysis and they found that it's not working very well. And we are, again, going backward on transportation, in particular, again, because of all of the driving that's happening. And one thing that they found in the report, and I just think it's really important, also from a health perspective, is even if we were to increase our electric vehicles by 10 times, and just to set the baseline here, so California has 27 million cars. 660,000 of those are electric today. California, unlike East Coast, I'm from Wisconsin, so unlike where I'm from, the cars don't rust out here. So it's another difference with California.
Right.
And so people hold onto their cars for a very long time. 2 million plus of those are over 20 years old. And people here hold onto their cars for 15 years is not unusual, actually. So the turnover rate is incredibly slow. But CARB found that even if we were to increase by 10 times, we would still need a 25% reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And that's because, again, turnover is slow. But it's also, I mean, to me, there's a lot of other issues embedded in here, right? So it isn't just about what kind of emissions your vehicle has. It's about the fact that our land use patterns, we cannot continue allowing for these kinds of commute patterns. I mean, we lose 50,000 acres a year of agricultural land to urban uses in this state because of sprawl development. So people are being pushed further and further out from job centers, from service centers. It is a health crisis. I think somebody told me the other day, 21,000 deaths a year from inactivity, physical inactivity, essentially. People are in their cars for 2 to 3 hours a day, not doing other things, not getting activity, not walking around, not biking around, not being with their kids and families. But we also, the land, if we're losing that much land, it kind of goes to what Kevin was saying. Losing that land means people are moving into high-risk fire areas. The impacts from fires aren't just from burning trees, they're from burning plastic PVC pipes and the stuff that's in people's houses, which is then becoming part of what this, the ashes in the air and people are breathing. So these things are all interconnected. And so we really, in my office, and I think increasingly in the state, are just really doubling down on this issue that we cannot get to transportation without talking about both vehicles and fuels and land use. Because if you just do vehicles and fuels, or if you just are like, autonomous electric vehicles are going to save us all, you're talking about the same land use patterns, the same loss of ag land, the same sprawl development into high risk zones, fire, flood, whatever, and impacts on all kinds of stuff, food supply and stuff. And you just have people driving around all the time, or cars driving around all the time.
Well, and we talked about this briefly, Steve, but I think, I always wonder if people in California understand sort of how bad the public transportation systems are. And I'm not just talking, it is a very big state. It's, would be challenging to get from Humboldt to Los Angeles no matter what. But I'm talking about getting from San Francisco across to Oakland can be, many hour odyssey on multiple pieces of transit that take different payment systems, right? So do you mentioned sort of that DC has been in good shape in a way because because they just,
Yeah.
they've had a little bit of a benefit because they had a public transportation system that sort of predated their massive explosion of population. Do you have a sense of, where California is in the public transportation? How are we doing?
Yeah, well, it could be better, obviously. I mean, in DC, we were lucky, really, because no one was really thinking about climate issues, that we had a major launch of this metro system we have, which, leaves a lot to be desired, but still carrying more than 500,000 people a day to and from work. And the thought of those people being on the streets in cars is kind of sobering. There was a bit of a drop, and this is kind of interesting also, because Uber
and Lyft.
was, and Lyft provided just enough extra convenience that people stopped taking the metro as much.
Here
We
too.
had, I think it was about a 10% drop in ridership.
Yep.
So that's an interesting problem to deal with. I also feel, and this is partly my bias, having lived in New York and Washington, that intracity mass transit is just super important. The high-speed intercity where you're going all over the damn country just doesn't seem to me to be that big an issue. If that same money had been put into intracity projects, it would have been a lot better, I think.
Well, I totally ignored your transit question, but just to push back on that a little bit for California, I think we need both. We actually have 25% of the vehicles downtown in San Francisco on any given day are Ubers and Lyfts, so we have the same problem. But we need both here. We actually need both much better and integrated transit systems, and we are all in on having a unified fare system. It's very complicated, but everybody wants it. But also this intercity, it's actually high-speed rail plus regional rail is a goal for the state because we have so much travel between these parts of the state. We have 85,000 people a day coming over the Altamont Pass from the Central Valley into San Francisco right now.
Correct, yes.
Right, so this is a place where if there were a train, and people are talking about it, it would be a very different climate picture. I took the train to Bakersfield from Oakland the other day, and it is doable. It's a little bit slow, but there are reasons to do. I mean, it's not like it's not like we're going to magically. We are seeing a lot of growth in Central Valley Inland Empire. We need jobs and services in those places near houses. That's not going to happen overnight. We do need to figure out ways for people to move around with the current growth patterns that we have.
I do think the convenience factor is hard to get people away from that.
That's true.
So, we just extended the metro out to Dulles Airport, and, I still take a taxi because it's going to take me 3 times as long to get out there. And my kid just started working at PBS NewsHour, which is in Shirlington, which is not a great place from a commuting point of view. She drives there in 20 minutes, borrowing the car, and and getting there by mass transit would take 2 different metros, a bus, and a couple of long walks, and get her there in about an hour and a quarter.
Yeah.
So our transit
we need to
design
redesign
is
it.
not
Yeah, exactly.
supporting people going to work.
Yeah.
So transit design, as I've observed it, traveling to a lot of cities over the years and living in 5 of them, has always been focused more getting people to go shopping than it has to be getting people to work, quite honestly. And that's frustrating. I think it's frustrating especially to people who would like to use it to go to work. You mentioned, I live 8 miles from my office. You would think I could get on a bus and take that same bus because it's also main streets. However, I would have to go one direction, get off, take a transfer, take me an hour and a half to do that 12-minute drive. But I want to talk about the Valley in particular and connecting it to cities. So high-speed rail's real, folks. By the way, I drive by it all the time. Huge bridges, miles of them, all built. Tunnel under half of Fresno, all built. So just saying, we're hoping to see in the original deal, as I remember, was the first route, Merced to Bakersfield, gets done. Then the private money says, we'll come in when you can operate a train. I remember those conversations, and so we stay on it and stay with it. But how do we get people from those cities here to work? Modesto is a bedroom community because my son-in-law drives here to work, to Dublin. And that city is full of people. Los Banos, for God's sake, 110 miles away, people are commuting into the bay, into Livermore and the Livermore Valley every day. Do you know what that does to their health?
Well, I was going to say, can we jump to the health really quickly?
Yeah, sure.
So we all, we're very familiar with the transportation.
I was
woes.
about to move that direction.
Yeah, no, and one thing that's really shocking, and Kevin, I'll let you speak to this, but we're talking about this sort of from a big global perspective in parts of California, but in the Valley, because of the meteorology there, people know that at 9:30 a.m., the pollution is worse than it's going to be in other parts of the day after the morning commute. It is very severe, and they're feeling the effects.
In the wintertime.
Right now, in the wintertime, thank you. And they're feeling the effects right now. Can you talk a little bit just about what those are?
Sure. The Valley is stuck under an inversion, and some parts of the Inland Empire are similar, by the way, accounting for Riverside having the worst pollution in the nation for many years until we took over in the Valley. We just took it away from them. Took it away. So that inversion, sitting at around as low as 500 feet, keeps everything that's there. So while those emissions would normally go up, travel up a few thousand feet, disperse and spread out, and these are emissions from heavy-duty diesel. That's the scary thing. This is, as I mentioned, it's a short-lived climate pollutant, tremendously potent, elemental black carbon, very dangerous. The other pollutant that causes a lot of health effects from transportation, of course, transportation refrigeration units, which people don't think about. How did that cold food get where it is? It traveled on a truck that has a refrigerator on it that uses a refrigerant that is 1,000 times, several thousand times more potent as a climate destroyer than carbon. So how many of those do we have? Tens of thousands of them. What's the other problem? Where do you think that stuff is stored till it gets on the truck? Giant warehouse refrigeration units. Again, and these things leak a lot, okay? So people are living adjacent to those. So we're seeing the health conditions that result from those long-term exposures. Things like hypertension. We're seeing it a lot more, not just in people who are overweight. We've got lots of skinny patients who have hypertension. We have a lot of people, as I mentioned, with asthma. We have a lot of people who are developing diabetes who are not obese. Diabetes, contrary to popular belief, while obesity is one of the risks, many people who are thin develop diabetes. So I don't walk into the waiting room when I saw patients up until 3 years ago when I quit doing that to go into this full time, which is something I desperately miss, I can tell you, some days. I never walked into the waiting room and looked for skinny or fat or any other kind of people when I was looking for the next patient who had that disease, okay? It doesn't work that way. These health effects are being spread across everyone who lives there. There's this sort of rhetoric going around that's true to a certain extent, absolutely, that this effect is disproportionately experienced by certain communities. It is only because the sources of that pollution have been placed because of poor land use decision makings across the last 100 years that perpetuate this huge racial injustice of putting these sources directly in these communities. But good news for you folks, the emissions that come from them go everywhere, because this inversion is not a respecter of your income or your race or ethnicity. So nobody's getting away with it. Some people think they are. There are definitely people who are more impacted by it because they're not only experiencing the direct emissions, but also the vehicles that support that, which again, heavy-duty trucks and heavy equipment on these facilities. You see it in the ports. You definitely see it in the Inland Empire, which has been destroyed by this, I would argue, as an environment to live in. And again, I'll argue that with anyone. And the Valley, which is largely going that way, turning from an area. I was very interested to note anecdotally that a TV program called The Big Valley was filmed there in Bakersfield back in 1969. And at that time, they were right down outside of Bakersfield, and it was all these beautiful hills. It was live shooting. And it was green. It was gorgeous. Not so anymore. So the last thing I want to mention with transportation is I had the pleasure to sit beside a gentleman from LBNL, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, who was tasked by Governor Brown with determining exactly how many vehicles, cars, would have to be electrified in order to not disrupt the oil and gas industry. The number he came back with was half of them. There's 26 million, half of them. I can't even conceive of when we would convert a 26 million car vehicle fleet to electric vehicles. So we have to think
I think
beyond
it's
that.
actually more than that, because we use 100% of the oil we produce in this state. which
That's
is
the number that he
37,
gave me.
We use
So-
37% of our oil is from California, so we'd actually have to get to whatever the difference is there.
So we have to move off. My point is that in the valley especially, we need to move off this oil and gas economy. But we have to do it in a way that doesn't destroy the valley economy. If you're in southern San Joaquin and you live in Kern County, the reason you have a decent quality of life there is because of the oil and gas industry.
That's true.
We often talk about just transition. Just transition was not what happened in Ohio in 1975 when the steel mills laid off 65,000 people. That's destruction. So we can't do that if we can avoid it. I know there's a feeling that we need to, but this is the work that lays before California to lead yet again in determining what is, and I know I got off the health topic here a bit, but what does, and I would challenge everybody in this room to be able to think, how do I justly transfer somebody from a job making $75,000 a year to another job that does that doesn't affect the climate?
And Kate, I don't know if
without the education to go with it. And this job is affecting their health, right? If you work in oil and gas, you're exposed to pollution on a daily basis. But yet people will take that hit in order to make that money to support their families.
Right, and I don't know if you want to respond to that quickly. I also want to make sure we get to heat and
Absolutely.
briefly, and then
Yeah.
also leave plenty of time for questions. So we'll try to keep this really quick. But I don't know if you have a response to if there's a plan for how to deal with that.
I actually have the
I know there's
honor
a
of
plan.
being in charge of the Just Transition Strategy for Kern County, so I think about this a lot. We are doing, the state has a goal, as you know, that Governor Brown set out, but Governor Newsom has reiterated, of carbon neutrality by 2045, and Governor Newsom has put into play 2 studies that the Cal EPA are doing, both of which look at what that looks like how do we actually move in that direction, not prescriptively, not like this is exactly what we're going to do every year, but essentially, if you're looking at 2045, let's do 5-year increments and figure out what the key benchmarks are going to have to be and what the key levers are going to have to be. We're looking at both the demand side and the supply side on transportation. So we're looking at the vehicles and fuels situation, and electrification obviously is a huge piece of that, as is land use reform. But we're also looking at the supply side, because as you know, we're I think the 5th largest now oil producing state in the country. Again, we're another way in which California is weird. We're an odd oil producing state because we don't export any of it. We use 100% of what we produce here. And again, it's 37% of what we use altogether. And it's very, very concentrated in Kern County and Los Angeles County. But for Kern County, the economy is extraordinarily dependent. So one of the pieces of the supply side study is actually a look. My office, the Department of Labor, the Department of Workforce Development are working on what we're calling a high road economic strategy for the state as a whole, actually, in a lot of different areas. We're looking at it across warehousing, a whole bunch of things. But in Kern County in particular, really looking at both at how we can think about economic diversification in that region, which is a very resource-dependent region. And I think it's a series of kind of bottom-up conversations with a lot of people in the region, workers, employers, community folks. It's going to not be an overnight thing. There is no answer to the question that you asked about where the job. There's no one-for-one replacement of jobs, and I think going in with that perspective is important. But the other thing people often don't think about with resource-dependent economies is that the tax base is extremely resource-dependent.
Yes.
So this is true in Kern County. It's true in Wyoming. It's true in West Virginia. Was true in Louisiana. You have an economy that has a industry that you can take royalties. You can do different kinds of tax structures in order to have a tax base that keeps you through the volatility of that industry. It's like, so you basically are building a tax base to allow you to deal with that rise and fall. You see it in some agricultural places too. We have to deal with that as well, because it's not just about sort of like, oh, we can just replace these industries. You're also, and think about job training, you're also thinking about taxes. And I'll just say one thing on that, which is interesting. So we often, as a state, put a lot of incentives into, obviously, carbon neutral solutions. And Kern County is also the renewable energy capital of the country, interestingly. Biggest wind and solar farms.
Yep.
Those wind and solar farms got a tax break from the state when they were put in to Kern County because we were encouraging wind and solar farms, but they don't provide anything to the tax base. So that's an interesting, we just do need to think about these things when thinking, so it's like goes back to, there are absolutely all kinds of health impacts in particular, but also economic impacts in these places, and those two things go hand in hand. If I have a union $80,000 to $100,000 job in the oil industry, I have health care.
Right?
If I have a non-union,
retirement.
itinerant,
Yeah.
temporary job building solar panels, I don't. So that is an interesting piece of the
My
conversation.
kids are going to college, I have health care, I drive a nice car, and I have a decent house. I think, and I'm not suggesting that none of these things can happen. I think they all need to happen, and they must happen. I think the pace is always the key here. Right? I mean, as you're talking about 2045, I'd love to see that happen. I think that's ambitious, and it should be.
Well, I would just, the one last thing I wanted to say is that this whole idea of high road jobs, which is we didn't invent, but is that they are both sustainable and family supporting. So we really do feel like a big piece of the solution on the health side, on the economic side, on sort of changing the whole dynamic around disadvantaged communities is actually getting an economy where people have decent jobs.
Well, can I ask one thing? I think it's not one. I think you're perfectly on track. I think it's not one or the other, though. I think the state can play a huge role here. So you mentioned the different pieces that job brings. The security, which reduces stress, which, by the way, stress is pretty much, we all know in medicine, is the root cause of pretty much every health problem that you could possibly have. So, and in fact, it increases your vulnerability to poor health and infections from outside vectors tremendously. But if the state provided health care, if we had free college for everybody in California, if food was priced appropriately for people to get it, I wouldn't need to make $75,000 a year. You see what I'm saying? If housing was reasonably affordable, I wouldn't need to make all that money. So they're making the money, and they see that as to live in California at this lifestyle, which is not flagrant. It's just a normal, middle-income lifestyle. I never would have thought that $75,000 would have been middle income, but it is. And that's all they're asking. So how do we replace some of those pieces so that job in solar you're talking about that only pays $20 an hour can still support that same lifestyle? And that, to me, is a much more interesting exercise. And I believe that's what you're thinking, correct? That it's more complicated than just, we're going to somehow take. The high road's a great way to look at it, I suppose, but there's always a low road to go with the high road. So anybody who's from historically genetically linked to Scotland can tell you that. I just think we have to think really outside. There is no box, right? Get rid of boxes. I think of life as this flat plane in every direction, and I can go anywhere.
Let's talk about one other thing, and then I really want to make sure we have time for the audience to ask some questions. So heat, we know, is also a really big risk. It has a lot of economic risks as well as health risks. The health risks, I think, are something that are a little more tangible and easy for us to understand than some of the other kind of things linked to climate change. But they also, there's a lot that has to do with jobs and people who work outside. Steve, you've written a lot about the places that have already achieved this sort of metric of 2 degrees Celsius temperature change on average, including in the United States, and there's a lot of places that's happened. Can you just give us a sense of where in California is already reached that metric?
Yeah,
or is at risk
so
of having?
we've been doing a series at the Post called 2C, which is about all the places in the world, as you say, that have already blown past the 2 degrees Celsius target that we were supposed to conform to by the year 2100. So the Earth doesn't heat up evenly, so this is happening at different paces in different places. I went to Qatar to write about it, where probably at least 200 people and perhaps as many as 1,500 people have died doing construction work from heat exhaustion. And and there is a very special place because you have humidity coming up from the Persian Gulf, and yet there's a lot of dryness on the interior, so there's really no rain. And, it can become quite stifling, and at some point, it's not inhabitable, really, although there are nearly 3 million people living in Doha. So here in the States, we looked at this county by county, breaking down NOAA and NASA data. So in California, Ventura County is one of the hottest, I shouldn't say hottest because it's not a question of heat, it's a question of the difference from the pre-industrial baseline in the late 1800s to the present. Right. So, and the Earth is halfway there already. So we're talking about people who are, we're at places that are warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. So Ventura County is definitely in that category, and there are a lot of reasons for that. It's kind of complicated, but we're seeing, it's one of the places here which is obviously be under stress for, fires and other health problems.
Well, and you're bringing up a point too that there's sort of coastal and inland in California, and the coastal might not have as high temperatures on a regular basis, but they're at more risk when they see those spikes because people frankly aren't used to it, and there's
not ready for them.
Infrastructure. Right. And the Cal EPA has done a lot of research on this, and there are specific risks for places that are more temperate compared to places that have high heat.
Well, and since you were nice enough to invite me here, one of the things I've been trying to figure out is talk to PG&E a bit about what this, because they see some of this a little bit differently, I think, and to some extent the same. That some of the greatest risks are in places that maybe should never have been settled to begin with, which is a hard thing to say, I think, but and hard if you're a governor, hard if you're the head of PG&E.
Yep.
So, but that's probably the truth, and they're getting a lot of. And they're trying to calculate that out into the future in a way that's going to translate into dollars, and that has to be done. And given the bankruptcy of the utility, and that's a tough thing to do.
Yes. One question for you, Kate, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. Do we need to change the way we think about labor standards and what the economics of what can be done outside going forward, given what we know about what is going to happen?
Yeah, California's actually done a little bit of that already. We have, Steve's absolutely right that there's increased risk for people in high-risk activities, which are across a bunch of things. Construction is a big one, and in parts of the Southwest they now only do construction at night for some of these reasons. But construction is a big one. But outdoor agricultural work is another one. A certain amount of manufacturing, depending on where you are. One thing California did before I worked for the state a couple of years ago is put labor standards in place for agricultural workers that actually require an air-conditioned sort of area for rest breaks every X number of feet or whatever in these places, and also a lot more water breaks than they had before, and those were directly responsive to what we were seeing in terms of heat projections. The increased heat is a really big deal, and it's particularly a big deal because the areas where we're going to see the most growth in the state is the projections for population, and there's all kinds of things that could change, but are 50 million people by 2050, which much of that growth will be inland and in the Central Valley, which is where we see a lot of these impacts. So a big question is, how do you start planning ahead? We're also doing a lot of thinking around urban heat island effects, urban forestry, urban greening. How do you start thinking through, again, not converting all your land to concrete because that has a huge warming effect. So lots and lots of things that have to kind of go together around that question. But I would argue, having done a lot of work in this space, we talk a lot about sea level rise in California because most of the people who work in the nonprofit community and advocates live on the coasts. But extreme heat is very likely a bigger deal. Fires as a chronic effect and extreme heat as a long-term effect are very, very big deal. And I think probably we'll see those impacts sooner and are already seeing them.
I want to just mention briefly that thank you for giving props to the Labor Department because Cal OSHA was tasked with deploying this policy, and for the Valley I was lucky enough to work with them to coordinate work in the 8 counties with labor contractors, with ag labor contractors. But a lot of that partnership between, that interagency partnership between California Department of Public Health, Cal EPA, and Cal OSHA allowed that to happen. And then enforcement has just been tremendous. So you've got women who are 7 months pregnant working in these fields in August. And you mentioned temperature rise. In the valley, we're seeing records. We may not be at 2C, but I believe we've probably gone up 1C, because we've definitely crossed from 115 is really weird to, wow, that's nothing. We hit 118 now, Fahrenheit. So it's a challenging thing. How do we keep this agriculture moving with this risk to the population that is feeding us?
But you're right, there has been a dramatic reduction in deaths and injuries and illness.
It's been a successful program.
In the agriculture.
It is a great program.
Which is, you know, it required some changes on behalf of the industry as well, but it did improve.
They changed,
things.
most of them.
Okay, we should do questions. Our friend Rakesh here has a microphone which he will pass around.
Reverend Earl Coteen, Green the Church. Hi, Kevin.
Hey.
Hi, Kate. Hi, Steve.
Reverend Earl.
The magnitude of the problem is several orders greater than any of the solutions so far proposed. My question is, how are we going to acquire the political will to make the changes that will dramatically reform our culture, our government, and our economics if we are to avoid incredible, unprecedented tragedy?
Kate, do you want
Political, Steve?
Sure.
Good job.
I mean,
Right from the political
we actually
will
have a lot of it already in California, so I'm worried. I want to hear about the national political will.
Is there any? Well, at least around
Well, I
this.
think that's one of the interesting things about the poll numbers is that there's some, but not a hell of a lot and not enough. So, and maybe we've all seen this in the presidential campaign. Inslee comes in as the environmental candidate and he's gone in no time. And now Tom Steyer is going to give it another shot and he'll probably meet the same fate. So I think it's a bit of a dilemma, because on the one hand, you want to motivate people, and a lot of the way people have done that is to scare the hell out of them. But when we vote for presidents, we tend to want optimists as president. So I think you've got a clash there that's hard to reconcile. And if you scare people too much, people will have a sense of futility and say, oh, we can't do anything. I did a piece for the Post that we kind of call our dark realism piece. And one of the things that someone told me for that piece was that they're a little worried about the importance attached to the 2-degree mark, because we're going to go past it. And he compared it to driving a car, and that you see you're going to crash. And so does that mean you take your foot off the gas, or you put the gas on high, or do you slam on the brakes? He said, no, you're supposed to still slam on the brakes. So we should all be, his point was being that everyone should be trying, even though they see that this wall is coming closer.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my whole career has been about unusual allies and trying to get beyond sort of the base of kind of folks who are already with us on these issues, and that's why I get sent to Bakersfield to talk about carbon neutrality. But my experience doing that has been, it's partly like, how do you open the conversation? I mean, I think that unfortunately in the climate community, we sometimes have a bad habit of going into a room like with folks in the agricultural sector and saying, let me show you this pie chart of what a problem you are.
Yeah.
And like, let's talk about what you're going to do about that. And that is that's an immediately defensive, like there's, of course, if you did a poll 5 minutes after that beginning, somebody would be like, I don't think there's a problem, like I'm not going to deal with that, right? But if you go into these conversations with, look, we're having an honest discussion here. Like here's what we're seeing. You're already experiencing it on the ground. You're already seeing crop yield declines. You guys are the experts on this stuff. What are you doing? What can we do together? How can we accelerate it? It's just a different conversation. And I do think that there's I get very concerned by the sort of the move towards shame as the way that people begin these conversations. And I really think we have to get back to, and health is a good way to do this, what are our shared impacts? What are our shared, like, reactions, and what are we living every day? And then how do we actually work together to try to get there? And yeah, it's not going to be fast enough. It's not going to be fast enough. But honestly, like, if you don't operationalize this stuff and try to break it down into stuff you can do, we'll all just put our heads on our pillows. I mean, there's no, you have to find a way forward. Right?
So
I think there's
one
always
more quick thing I wanted to add, which is that one of the things I did a piece about 5 years ago was whether climate change was going to be like the gay marriage issue. That suddenly the entire country of ordinary people were moving one direction on this issue, and the Republicans in Congress suddenly thought, oh my gosh, there's no one with us anymore. And you saw a huge shift in the kind of political establishment too. So one of the things I'm wondering is whether climate could be that kind of issue. Now, if I was right about that, and I was thinking 5 years ago, we'd still only be halfway there, and I'm not sure whether we're halfway there. And that was one of the things I was happy that we did this climate poll on, is looking for some kind of evidence in that area.
It's interesting.
And although it's sort of, there's big gaps as you saw, but still I think might be a little movement, not as much as I hoped we'd find in the poll. But one of the things that wasn't mentioned that I guess you can think of as encouraging or discouraging is, I think, as I recall, among supporters of President Trump, the issue that they were most unhappy with him, and they generally are very happy with him, that group, so this isn't a huge number, but of all the small numbers that they were unhappy with him about, the highest was on climate issues.
Oh, that's so interesting.
I think if you approach this, Earl, if you approach this with everybody, and I think you illustrated this well, from this idea that we all want good health. There's nobody who doesn't want that. We all agree that an environment that is unhealthy is bad for us. And when I start talking to, and I do, anybody, industry, ag leaders, industry leaders from various industries, that's how I start the conversation. Let's talk about what we agree on, and then what are you doing to help get us there, to help create that change? And when the leader of your business starts talking about it that way, then you have the people who work for them saying, oh, wow, well, I guess this is the way to go, yeah. But right now, we've created this, this sort of antagonism, and then many of those leaders are saying, no, they're trying to put us out of business. So then you have the people who work for them reacting by supporting somebody like Donald Trump. And so we need to change that conversation. And everybody needs to get on board with that.
One way to change that conversation,
So in terms of the change, shifting the public, is this on?
It was for a second.
So I'm here as a medical physician with some other colleagues, and we see...
It's off. Your mic's off. Somebody needs to...
Close.
Is there a...
There.
It's, hello? Is it working?
No.
I'll repeat the question. Okay, go for it.
You can just be loud.
The medical community is seeing health as this universal value that can shift the public opinion. It's very hard for anybody to not care about kids' health, their own health, and seeing that as the anchor to bridge the divide of what we saw in the survey. And a curious question, actually mostly for you, Kate, is so there's a new vaping campaign, public messaging campaign about the health harms of vaping. $20 million, just like that, for vaping. Less than 10 people have died from vaping in California. Could there be a public health campaign, messaging campaign of the climate impacts on health in order to connect, like you said earlier, to connect climate to the economy, but more so to health in a way that would foster personal interest in action?
So the question is should there be a public health campaign the same way that the state is investing in a campaign around vaping to help people understand the connections between health and climate change?
I mean, it's always a good idea to have more education and information and to be figuring out different audiences and how to speak to different audiences. My challenge with that question, I just tend to think there isn't one way to talk about this issue, mostly because you have to ask the question of what are you trying to do? What are you trying to have people do as a result of the campaign? So with smoking, it's a fairly clear connection, what you're trying to have people do. And actually with gay marriage, there was a coalescence from the advocacy community around a policy, which was not originally the policy. I mean, gay marriage was not the policy of interest for many advocacy groups, and everyone coalesced. It was a tactical campaign. What is the thing that we're trying to do? And I think one of the really challenging things about working on climate change is that there's like 47,000 things. And most of them are not things individuals can do, although there are certainly things individuals can do and should be doing more of. And I certainly think from the poll, I'm fascinated. I think we should get much better education around what individual actions actually matter and which individual actions don't. That's really important.
Voting.
But there isn't a way. I mean, what does it mean to be a climate voter? I think it's a really interesting question. Does it mean you're voting for someone who talks about climate change all the time? Or does it mean you're voting for someone who has a really good, economic development policy for specific parts of the country? Or does it mean you're voting for someone who's involved in international funding for the places most affected? Or does it, it's a million different things. So my concern with that kind of approach is I don't know what we're trying to ask people to do. And I always worry that if you are doing generalized education, except for, again, I do think people need more education about how the energy system works, frankly, and what it is that leads to climate change. But because I think ultimately that leads to better decisions across the board, but I don't know what the campaign is for. And that's always been a challenge. And I'm sure people have many, and we can argue about this for days, but that's been my concern with that question.
I just want to briefly mention what healthcare providers could do. That I think your task is, and my task is, when I see patients, and I'm an allied health provider as a registered respiratory therapist, asthma clinical specialist, but I need to talk to them about how this climate is affecting their health. And I need to be very specific about that. I need to know what those are. And so for your work, to me, that's the work you can do, because you're so busy seeing patients. I can't drag you out of the office or the hospital up to Sacramento or into Washington when I need you, right? We recognize that limitation. Some folks, but not many. I mean, we just had a conference 2 weeks ago at Tenaya Lodge where I had two physicians, John Baums, who leads California Air Resources Board, and Alex Sheriffs, who's also on the board, who are both practicing physicians, talk about that. What are the challenges they face in getting out this information about climate to communities about that health? And it's really the fact that they're so damn busy with the business of healthcare, they can't figure out how to do it. So that's what you can do. One patient at a time, one visit at a time. It makes a difference.
We have time for just one more question, unfortunately.
So, I don't know if this is working.
Is it still not working?
Should be. It's okay, yeah. So I had a question about specifically around Common Ground and California's what we can do in our legislation, particularly with Sacramento. And I was thinking, I feel like a lot of what we do is a little bit wonky, but we're trying to protect SB 100. And so a lot of the groups who are working around legislation are just trying to don't and cringe on SB 100. And then there were some vetoes that happened this past time with SB 1 and a few things. And I'm wondering around Common Ground and what we can get through the Assembly and the Senate and what we can get passed in Newsom's office, what are some low-hanging, or not low-hanging fruit, but what's a common ground? Should we be, with volunteer organizations, should we be focusing on transportation? Should we be telling our Assembly people and our senators to really be, we're telling them what to write, right? And so, yes. as citizens,
writing it often.
Yeah. As citizens lobbying groups, what are things that we can actually get passed?
I mean, I don't know if I can answer the second one of those questions. It's a very, California, I will say, having worked in the federal government, The California legislative situation is fascinating. It's advocates actually do write the legislation, as do lobbyists, and they not only write it, but they say they write it. Like, advocates sponsor legislation, which I've never heard of before. There are so many legislators that are all running for their next thing that they won't co-sponsor bills. So you'll have like 17 bills that say the same thing with each with an individual author, and then there's this whole process of winnowing them down, and then thousands of them get to the governor's desk. It's a crazy system, and we refer to them all by number because they're not named, and the numbers get repeated. So you're like, oh, SB whatever. You're like, what SB? Like SB1 was also the highway bill. So like, it's very confusing. Anyway, I don't know what can get through that system. It's a complicated system. I will say this, that one of the things the governor had me do when I first started was to look at every single goal we have in the state on climate change. And from any statute, executive order, or California Energy Commission or Public Utility Commission regulation. Get a list of all of them, a spreadsheet of all of them, and figure out where we are in meeting them all. And then from that, do a gap analysis of where we're not meeting our goals. And so he was like, he's very data driven. So he was like, where should we be focused, given that? It's rational exercise. And the three answers to that question are: one, transportation. And again, both on the vehicle side and the land use side. Two, land use generally. So this whole question of our value on our natural and working lands. And how do we assign value in the climate context to our natural and working lands? And the third one is climate resilience. It's the immediate action. What do we do now to help reduce our risk? Those are the big areas. We're actually very far down the path on electricity, which is the thing that we love to invest in. But we have done a lot. We've been great. We're very far down the path. We're pretty far down the path on methane. You'd be surprised. We're actually well on our way on methane regulation. Agriculture is well on its way. Our methane manure management rules are extraordinarily effective. Like, we're actually getting there with a bunch of things, but we're not on those three that I just mentioned.
And I would agree on transportation's the nut that's hardest to crack. And there's a group that's put together as kind of interactive game you can play. And the hardest line to move is the transportation line.
What's the game called?
It's a climate interactive thing that we hope to have up on our website.
Is this the energy innovation thing? Is it their thing? Hal Harvey's thing?
No, it's not.
Okay, he's got one too. Okay.
Yeah,
I would argue in California it's land use, quite honestly.
Land use is harder here.
It's the sacred cow of California politics, and it's the least available to control from the state office.
We actually have it in our Constitution. It's interesting. People are always saying to me, why can't you be like Oregon and ban single-family housing, like zoning across the state?
Can't do that.
Oregon in the 70s changed their Constitution to allow them to do planning at the state level. It was actually farmers and ranchers that did that to protect farms and ranches. We have in our Constitution that is a local control issue to do land use. So we're very, very constrained. This is partly why we're so constrained on homelessness and housing.
Which is, I think I hear you saying it's not just a state issue, but
it's
also
very much a local.
Thinking at the local.
Frankly, going back to your voting question, one of the single most important things we as individuals in this state can do is engage with our local councils and local boards of supervisors around land use issues being climate issues. That is a very critical thing to do. Highly recommend everybody do it.
100% agree.
Unfortunately, we need to wrap up. We could, okay, I'm hearing we can do one more question. Which I'm going to let.
Exactly.
You're just having a...
Hi, my name is Eliza Nemser. I have some low-hanging fruit that does not require state legislation or $20 million and will drastically increase public awareness. There are millions and millions of school-aged children in the state of California between the ages of 2 and 18 who are technically a sensitive group in terms of air pollution.
Right, that's true.
Okay, currently, during school days, when the air quality is unhealthy for sensitive groups, orange air, AQI over 100, they are exercising outdoors on the schoolyard. When the air quality is over 150, they are exercising outdoors on the schoolyard. Over 150, unhealthy for everyone. Over 100, unhealthy for sensitive groups. That's because school administrators make decisions about when to bring the children indoors to protect their lungs, protect their health, based on statewide protocols. There's several that exist. There's some EPA ones, there's some state ones. OEHA, the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment, issued a new one in November. And currently they're not health protective. In fact, they're not as health protective as Washington states. In Washington state, they bring them indoors at 100 for, athletic practice and for PE. So totally low-hanging fruit, doesn't cost anything, doesn't require legislation, but just altering these statewide protocols protocols so that they are actually health protective, such that during active wildfire events or in the absence of active wildfire events, when there are elevated levels of PM 2.5 due to inversion impacting the air across the state, children are brought indoors and appropriate measures are taken to protect their health. So this would drastically increase public awareness, because all of those millions of children have parents. And really, parents don't actually know if it's safe for their kids to be exercising outdoor in air that is orange, unhealthy for sensitive groups. They just don't know. And they're checking airnow.gov for information on real-time local air quality data. The sensors are spaced so widely that they're actually getting time average, spatially average data. No one knows exactly what they're breathing, and no one knows appropriate measures to take. So this is like a climate adaptation thing. It's a climate preparedness thing. It's a protecting health thing. And it's free, and the more people know about actually, like, wow, we should move indoors at 150, we should move kids indoors at 100, the more people know that, the more those poll numbers are going to change.
So I can speak authoritatively to this?
Yeah, as a question, do you
In the San Joaquin Valley, interestingly enough, the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District, and I never thought I would have said this, is the most progressive agency with regard to this specific issue. They developed the Healthy Air Living Schools program. I know because the organization I started and didn't work for, but led from another job, along with my colleague Tim Tyner, who developed with John Baums the real-time outdoor activity guidelines for just this same program, vended this program around to all the schools for 5 years. We did this work in the Valley, over 1,500 schools. We had over 40 school districts adopt it. Last year on a Friday afternoon, where the air quality was at just over red, in Kern County, the county shut down football games for every high school in the county that night. You want to hear people scream, oh my God. But it served its purpose. It got people's attention. And so many schools in the Valley have adopted this. The district has also created a program called the Real-Time Air Advisory Network that schools can put in the address of their school and get that calculated, statistically calculated air quality at their school site, because the school administrators and the board members I spoke to, their main concern was, what's the air quality at my school? Because I really don't want my kids outside when it's dangerous, but I also know that outside activity is healthy for kids. So how do we balance that out? So that air pollution number is now given to them hourly during the day, so that they can make these decisions an hour ahead of time, essentially, in as real time as it gets. We're actually working with them, my organization, to improve that system, and we want to update the WARE guidelines because we think they could be more prescriptive, but they're sure better than anything else anywhere else in California right now. So, just FYI, happy to send that to you.
What is the website you're asking?
It's actually the Air District's website. So if you go to the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District's website, I think it's valleyair.gov. No, .org. They're a special district.
Is it
Would they still be
.org?
.gov? I can't remember.
I thought they were .gov.
Just the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. You can't miss it. They have a huge website, and just type into their search engine ROAR guidelines, and I think you'll be happy. I think it'll be useful to you.
Great. Well, this is the other
That's a whole different story,
The
okay?
last thing I was going to say is you don't want to bring them inside where there's formaldehyde and asbestos in the temporary buildings, which we have a lot of. Right. So there is a school bond on the ballot next year. So another area that you might not think about being a climate voter.
For capital?
Yeah, for capital dollars? For facilities. But voting on a school bond for facilities in this state is in fact an act of climate voting. So that's another one to pay attention to.
Common myth. No capital dollars come from the state through the standard button-the-seat dollar that the schools get. So they have to figure out how to pay for their buildings and update them
through
from
local bonds.
That local tax.
Yeah, mostly through local bonds. So this is a state bond to get to a bunch of parts of the state that don't do a lot of local bond measures.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for being here, and obviously there's lots of interest in this topic. There's lunch back here. You can pick up a lunchbox to go with you, and yeah, we're so glad you came and hope that we can continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists.
Right? Well, I gotta get out of here.